With a wide variety of movement options and plenty of iconic glitches, it's no surprise that after 30 years, Super Mario 64 is still incredibly popular, especially for speedrunning, with a total submitted playtime on speedrun.com of over 4 years, second only to Super Mario Odyssey. And it's not just real-time speedruns. Mario 64 has a legendary TAS or Tool Assisted Speedrun community, where, by precisely choosing controller inputs on each frame of gameplay, people attempt to create theoretically perfect speedruns. The desire to learn everything about the game has produced the Decompilation project giving the full source code, the diagnostic tool Stroop that allows you to view and edit all the game's variables in real time, and the jewel in the crown, the A button challenge, a monumental collaborative puzzle where the community works together to collect as many stars as possible without ever pressing the A button, developing countless mind-boggling tricks and glitches. But when Mario isn't visiting parallel universes or performing unethical cloning experiments, he spends the majority of his time in the air. It's surprising then that it took until 22 years after the game's release to solve a fundamental problem. If Mario is moving in the air, what sequence of inputs gets us from point A to point B in the shortest time? In other words, how do we perform the perfect jump? If you know anything at all about this game, you know it can't be something as simple as holding the control stick in that direction. When we're in the air, we can strain Mario in a particular direction by holding the control stick. But the game handles forwards and backwards strainings very differently from sideways straining, and this produces some counterintuitive results. The actual way to get from A to B in the shortest time involves straining Mario in a different unique angle on each frame of his movement, starting with straining mostly forwards and gradually transitioning to straining mostly sideways. And if we take the straining angles for each frame in this example and plot them over time, we find that they perfectly match the arctan function, the inverse of the tangent function that you might remember from school. And this is no accident. The optimal straining angles follow an arctan function for any number of frames in any direction you want to travel in. The function naturally describes the perfect transition between forwards and sideways straining that gives us the most distance. And on this circular plot, with time increasing from the center outwards, we can see the transition very explicitly. And it's even more pronounced if we strain over a longer time period. This technique is called Arctan Straining, and was first discovered in 2018 by TASer Iwerlipse, and in his honour, the range of positions Mario can occupy while air straining is called the Iwerlipse. Arctan Straining gives us the greatest possible distance in situations where Mario is in the air and cannot turn, that is, normal double and triple jumps, flying triple jumps, free falling, long jumps, dives and dive rollouts, backflips, side flips, wall kicks and slide kicks, and jump kicks, pole jumps, air throws, crazy box bouncing, wind riding and shell jumping. All of these actions can be optimized by Arctan Straining. And yet, because of an intimidating formula and complicated mathematical proofs, it's caused a lot of confusion over the years. The major sources of information seem to be a very useful practical tutorial by Crackhex and a very outdated Wikipedia article, which hopefully has been updated by the time you're watching this. Everything else I had to figure out on my own or by trawling through 8 years worth of Discord messages. And that's why I wanted to make it as close to a definitive resource for Arctan Straining as possible. So in this video we're going to look at the basic mechanism, prove that it's optimal by using simple geometry, go through a practical example, and along the way look at the history and the people who made the discoveries or otherwise contributed to a greater understanding of them. So let's begin. The basic principle behind Arctan Straining is actually pretty simple. It's all a result of 2 lines of code that explain how the forward velocity and sideways speed are updated every frame. There are 2 asymmetries we notice. Firstly, the forward velocity accelerates gradually over time, whereas the sideways speed gets reset every frame. Secondly, straining has a weak effect on forward velocity for a single frame, but a strong effect on sideways speed. Here I'm showing my sideways speed and forward velocity in the top left of the screen, and as I strain directly forward, the forward velocity starts small and then accelerates, but as I strain directly sideways, the sideways speed is 10 on every frame. Let's take a simple scenario. For some reason, our controller is broken. And on every frame, we can only move the control stick directly up or directly left. Both choices move us close to our goal. But to reach the point B fastest, should we go left first and then up? Or up first and then left? Let's try going sideways first. Because of the strong sideways speed we can get, we very quickly gain the necessary horizontal distance. But when it comes to moving forward, our velocity starts very small, but quickly accelerates, and it takes 18 frames to reach our goal. Because of the accelerating forward velocity and the fact that it's not reset between frames, it's very beneficial to do the forward straining first, because even though we have a slow start, once our velocity is built up, we can start straining sideways, and our forward velocity will remain passively moving us forward. And we reach the goal in only 13 frames, a huge 5-frame improvement. If we look at the distance we move along this axis, the sideways first strategy is winning in the first half, but for the forwards first strategy, the early investment into acceleration soon pays off. This toy model with no drag and only 2 stick angles seems a bit naive, but the exact same mechanism happens in the full case, where we spend a long time straining forwards to accelerate as much as possible, and only towards the end do we gradually shift into sideways straining. As we've seen, the optimal way of doing this is described by this equation, and I just want to take a minute to demystify it. It looks scary, but it's actually completely equivalent to these 2 triangles, and without looking at the formula or even knowing what trigonometry is, we can just use this picture to determine how the straining angle depends on the direction we want to travel in, represented by the target angle omega, and the number of frames remaining in the period that we're considering, including the current frame. So as long as we can measure lengths and angles, we can figure out the optimal way to move Mario in the air. So let's imagine we're an ancient Greek mathematician and do an example. Say we want to maximize our distance along an angle of 33.75 degrees over 10 frames. The green angle immediately gives us the straining angle on frame 1, and if we reduce the height of the green triangle to 9, we get the straining angle on frame 2. Reduce it to 8 and we get the straining angle on frame 3, etc, etc. In each case, the side length of the green triangle is equal to the number of frames remaining. By the way, so far we've been assuming that Mario's facing along the z-axis, but if he's facing along a different angle theta, we just need to subtract the facing angle from the target and straining angles, and the same formula applies. And reflection symmetries make it easy to obtain the straining angles regardless of which quadrant our target angle is in. Before we prove that this really is optimal, let's turn the clock back to 2018. It's been 2 years since Pan & Koek made the A-button challenge famous, and the community is trying to collect the Blaster Stone Pillar Star in 0 A-presses. Enter Tyler Keeney, discoverer of Mario 64's parallel universes. On the 18th of March, he finds the last piece of the puzzle, demonstrating how to use conserved speed to get from this pillar to the star platform. And with another A-press save under their belt, attention quickly turns to whether they could build up enough speed to collect the last remaining star in Jolly Roger Bay, treasure of the ocean cave. Amid these discussions, people started wondering how to best strain Mario in the air to make the most of the limited speed they had available. In particular, Yves Sonch began talking about something he called vectoring, named after a very similar technique in Super Mario Odyssey. Vectoring means that instead of facing along the direction we want to travel, we can gain greater distance by angling Mario so that both his forward and sideways speed contribute to the distance along the intended direction. Vectoring definitely seemed promising for squeezing out a bit of extra distance, but the forward and sideways speeds can't be changed independently. They both depend on how we hold the control stick. So throughout March and April 2018, the community started to wonder how the forward acceleration should be balanced by sideways speed to gain maximum distance within a certain time. In other words, how to perform optimal straining. And with this, we emerge from prehistory and into the modern history of Arctan Straining. To frame the question more formally, let's say we're airborne and have a certain number of frames before we lose so much height that we'll miss this ledge. We don't care at what point along the edge we reach, as long as we reach it, or even better, go beyond it. In other words, we want to go the furthest possible distance along some target angle omega. Notice that we don't care about the total distance we move, only the distance along this direction. So, for example, these points all have the same distance. Our goal is to find the optimal sequence of inputs that maximize this distance, for any target angle and over any number of frames, capital T. If you're really on the ball and paying attention, you'll have realized that this is a slightly different question than the one I started the video with, where we were trying to reach an exact point B, but we'll soon see that they're entirely equivalent problems. The community already understood the basic principles of what would later become Arctan Straining, pushing forward to gain speed and then at the end exploiting the large sideways displacement for the last few frames. With the benefit of hindsight, we now know that we need to strain sideways compared to the target angle for exactly 6 frames, regardless of what that target angle is or how many frames we consider. In any case, the work began to make these ideas quantitative, and they already knew that when going from one frame to the next, all of Mario's next possible positions form an ellipse. More precisely, we move a constant distance due to our initial velocity, and then, by straining on the control stick, we can end up anywhere within an ellipse centered on that point. And this process happens for every frame that Mario is in the air. Let's look at the game's code to see why this happens. This is the function responsible for updating Mario's velocity variables when he's in the air and cannot turn. It depends on Mario's facing angle relative to the z-axis, his initial velocity, the straining angle, and the straining magnitude, i.e. how far we hold the control stick. The straining angle is by far the most important. Otherwise known as the intended yaw, it's the angle that the control stick is held relative to the game's z-axis, representing the direction that we're actually intending to move Mario in, regardless of which way the camera is facing. For example, holding up with this camera angle is the same as holding left with this camera angle. If the camera is facing along the z-axis, then the straining angle is just the angle at which we hold the stick. Let's start with some initial velocity and go through this function. First, there's some busy work. We declare some variables for later, check the weather forecast, and the first relevant part is this very simple function call. The game slows us down the tiniest bit by subtracting 0.35 from our forward velocity if it's positive, or adding 0.35 if it's negative. Or if the speed is so small that this would cause it to change sign, the speed is just set to 0. Next, if we're pushing the analog stick, the game decides how to update our speed based on its magnitude and direction. First, the game subtracts our face angle from the straining angle, and sets it as a new variable called the d-yaw. This represents the direction we're trying to move Mario relative to his facing angle. Since the dynamics depend only on this combination, not on the individual angles themselves, we're free to choose coordinates so that we're facing along the z-axis, and our face angle is 0. This makes our life a lot easier and is what we've been doing until now. Next, the game considers our straining magnitude, how far we're holding the control stick. In other parts of the code it's represented as a number between 0 and 32, but now the game scales it down to be between 0 and 1. Except for one potential nuance later, we can safely assume that holding the control stick all the way is always going to give the most distance, so this will just be set to 1. Now we come to the two most important lines of code that we've already seen. The game checks how far the control stick is pushed in the forward direction, multiplies it by 1.5 and adds that to our forward velocity. Then it checks how far our control stick is held to the side, multiplies it by 10, and sets that as our sideways speed. And this combination is how much extra distance we can get on this frame by straining. As our control stick makes a full rotation, this traces out an ellipse with a half width of 10 and a half height of 1.5. We'll soon be learning everything we could possibly want to know about this ellipse, but for now let's continue with the function. After taking into account our straining, the game applies the main source of drag. To stop us from building up too much speed, the game applies a soft speed cap. For long jumps, if our speed's above 48, it's subtracted by 1. And for any other jump, if our speed's above 32, it's subtracted by 1. These forward speed caps are only a soft cap. Since we can gain a maximum of 1.5 speed per frame, and drag can only reduce it by a maximum of 1.35, we can build up 0.15 speed every frame, and potentially build up infinite speed. Of course, the developers made sure there was absolutely no way for us to stay in the air indefinitely. In contrast, if our speed's below -16, the game slows us down by adding 2. Unlike with forward speed, this speed reduction is greater than the 1.5 speed we can get by straining, making sure that there's absolutely no way of building up ridiculous amounts of negative speed. For convenience, this major source of drag can be combined with the minor source of drag at the beginning of the function into a single variable, capital D. And if you have too much spare time on your hands, you can work out that the combined effects of drag can be written like this, or depicted graphically with our initial velocity increasing towards the right. These sudden drag boundaries are responsible for some weird behaviour, but a lot of the time they're far enough apart that the drag is constant over large periods of time, especially if we have large speeds in either direction, so for now we'll assume that the drag is constant. All that's left is to update velocities along the x and z axis. Thanks to our clever choice of facing Mario along the z axis, this is very simple. The z speed is equal to our forward velocity and the x speed is equal to our sideways speed. And with that, we understand everything that this function does. Here are the full update rules for general facing angles and straining magnitudes for reference, but all we really need to know is that we move a constant distance due to our initial speed and drag, and then by straining we can go anywhere within this ellipse. And as it turns out, Iver had already studied this ellipse in a different context to understand a glitch called a Pedro spot. With the community behind him, Iver set to work, and within a few weeks he'd found the optimal straining equation. The name Arctan Straining is stuck, but Iver actually gave the solution in terms of the arc cotangent, which is the same equation but with the numerator and denominator switched. And he simplified it further by introducing a variable r equal to the cotangent of our angle omega, and by writing it directly in terms of the number of frames remaining, which from now on will give the symbol t prime. Both forms are entirely equivalent to our magic triangle. My preferred form of the equation is this, because it has a nice symmetry to it and it sidesteps problems related to the range of the arctan function. So given that in a single frame we move within this ellipse, how did Iver figure out how to gain the most distance along some angle omega? Let's first understand where this ellipse comes from. If we draw one circle of radius 1.5 and another with radius 10, and draw a line at our straining angle phi, it crosses the large circle at an x value of 10 sine phi, which is our sideways speed, and it crosses the smaller circle at a z value of 1.5 cosine phi, which is the extra forward velocity we get by straining. And at the end of the frame, we end up at this intersection point. As we rotate the control stick through all angles, this constructs an ellipse. Note that the straining angle phi is not equal to the actual angle we move on the ellipse. The two are related by this familiar looking formula. And here we can see how they evolve together. If we want to maximize the distance along this angle omega in a single frame, we just draw a line that's perpendicular to the target direction and just touches the edge of the ellipse, and we find that we want to end up very far to the left over here. It may seem strange that our target direction is very close to forward, yet we want to end up so far over to the side, but I think this is clearer if we rotate the picture so that we want to travel straight ahead. If there's a ledge here, by going directly forwards we will miss the ledge. But if we strain to the side, we'll just make it. So what straining angle gets us to the point we need? Well, the gradient of this tangent line is equal to the tangent function of omega, which by the way is why it's called the tangent function in the first place. Whenever a line makes an angle with the x-axis, the tangent of that angle is equal to the gradient of the line. Anyway, we now just need to find the point on the ellipse where the gradient is equal to tan omega. Now we could use calculus to work this out, but if we don't know calculus, there's a trick we can use. An ellipse is just a squashed circle, so if we stretch our ellipse along the z-axis by a factor of 10 over 1.5, our ellipse will grow into our circle of radius 10, and the gradient of our tangent line increases by the same factor. But it's also clear that this tangent line now makes an angle of phi with the x-axis, so the gradient is also equal to the tan of phi, our straining angle. And by equating the two, we find the straining angle that maximizes the distance along omega over a single frame, which is just a special case of our general formula when there's only one frame remaining. You may have noticed a strong similarity between this formula for our target angle omega and this formula for gamma, the real angle we travel along. They are exactly the same except we swap 10 and 1.5, so while gamma traces out this ellipse, omega traces out this other ellipse with the width and height flipped. And if you want sensory overload, here's all three angles evolving together. You can almost feel yourself becoming hypnotized as you watch this. When I was first trying to figure this stuff out, I was really confused. If we can always gain the most distance on the next frame by straining at this angle, why is the multiple frame solution not just the same angle over and over again? In reality, this is true only for the final frame. In the other cases, the factor 1.5 is multiplied by the number of frames remaining until the end. This is because the forward velocity acquired on these frames will remain and accumulate distance not just on that frame, but over all the subsequent frames as well. Just like in our broken controller example, we saw that forward straining was more effective the earlier that we did it. This realization allows us to reduce our problem of optimizing over many different inputs into a series of individual optimizations. To understand how, let's use an analogy. What would you say if I give you a choice between two options? You can either receive £10 immediately or receive a daily income of £1.5 starting from today. You'd probably say, what are pounds? Well, they're like Mario coins but for British people. Anyway, if you're going to kick the bucket tomorrow, you should just take the £10. But as long as you survive until the end of the week, picking the daily income is the best choice. In this analogy, the instant £10 is like the sideways speed, providing a large short-term benefit, whereas the daily income is like the forward velocity, which has a greater outcome but requires a longer build-up. Now let's say you get this choice every day. By picking option B, you increase your daily income by another £1.5 every time. But the catch is that you only have a finite number of days, and after that you won't receive any more money. Our goal is to pick between A and B on each day to maximize our total earnings. Choice A obviously has a total effect of £10 on our total earnings regardless of when we choose it, but choice B has a different expected reward depending on when we pick it. Because it gives us a daily income, it depends on how many days are remaining until the end. On the first day, we'll get a daily income on all 10 days totaling £15, so we should pick option B. On the second day, we would get income on 9 days, totaling £13.5. This is still greater than 10, so we pick option B. On day 3 there are 8 days remaining, giving a total of £12, so we pick option B again. On day 4 there are 7 days remaining, giving a total of £10.5, so we pick option B. But on day 5 there are only 6 days remaining, so the total amount we would earn from an extra £1.5 of daily income is just £9. So for the first time we're better off just picking option A and the instant £10. And the same is true for all the remaining days. This example is exactly analogous to our broken controller example, where we are now trying to maximize our distance along a 45-degree angle. Option B is where we strain forward, and option A is where we strain sideways. This might have seemed like a silly exercise, but we've made a pretty big leap here. Rather than making a collective choice, we made our decision on each day or frame individually, based on how it affected the overall result, and we can do the same in the general case. Let's take the case of 2 frames. If we start from rest and strain at an angle, we end up at the edge of the ellipse, and the amount that we move forward is added to our forward velocity. This means that on the second frame, we first move forward by this new initial velocity, and then move within a new ellipse on that second frame. Now notice the effective distance we gained from straining on the first frame is twice the amount we strained forward, since we gained the distance on this frame and the one after, and this is true regardless of how we strain on the first frame. This means that, effectively, on the first frame, we move within an ellipse of twice the height. Then, on the second frame, we move within an ellipse centered on that point, with the original half height of 1.5. What about if we strain over 3 frames instead of 2? We strain on the first frame, gain some forward velocity which gives us extra distance on the second frame. Then, straining on the second frame increases our forward velocity even more, so that on the start of the third frame, we move an initial distance equal to the velocity we gained on the first frame, plus the velocity we gained on the second frame, and then we can strain on the third frame too. Now, we don't care about the intermediate positions, only the start and end points, so we can rearrange these arrows and realize that the effective distance we gain from straining on the first frame is now 3 times the amount we strained forward, since we gain the distance on this frame and, via the increase in velocity, also on the 2 remaining frames. The effective distance gained on the second frame is twice the amount we strained forward on that frame, since we gain the distance on this frame and the next frame. And on the final frame, we just move within the original ellipse, since there are no more frames after. This same process can be done over any number of frames. We group the arrows by on which frame that extra bit of velocity originated, and on each frame we effectively move within an ellipse with width 10, but with height equal to 1.5 times the number of frames remaining, including the current frame, representing the total distance acquired by accumulating the forward velocity gained on that frame over all the remaining frames. We have now reframed the problem so the effective distance we move on each frame is independent of every other frame. And now, to maximize our total distance along the angle omega, we can just maximize the effective distance for each ellipse independently. just like how we maximise the effective reward on each day of our economic problem. And we already know how to maximise the distance for a single ellipse. The proof is exactly the same as the single frame case, except that instead of a half height of 1.5, the half height is 1.5 times the number of frames remaining, which remember we gave the symbol t prime. We just find the point where the gradient is equal to tan omega, and again we can either use calculus or do our trick, scale the ellipse by a factor of 10 over 1.5 times t prime, so that the gradient of the tangent line is now 10 times tan omega over 1.5 times t prime, but at the same time it's also equal to the tan of our straining angle phi, and equating the two we finally obtain our optimal straining relation, and by taking the inverse we can write it in the arctan form. And we found the mathematically perfect inputs that maximise our distance over any number of frames. You may have noticed that we ignored drag and the initial forward velocity, but as long as the drag is constant throughout, their combined effect just amounts to a constant displacement that we can't control and doesn't affect the optimal straining angles at all. What I've shown is Iver's original proof, just displayed graphically. If you'd prefer to see the raw calculation, I've typed it up in detail in my notes, which I've attached in the description below. 2 months after Arctan Straining was discovered, Pan and Koeck posted a video with an idea for collecting the star at the top of a tall mountain without the A button, using a dive recover from a small area of raised ground, but he couldn't quite get enough distance, and as a first step towards proving whether or not it was possible, the idea emerged of using Arctan Straining to work out the complete range of positions Mary can occupy in a given number of frames. And even though Tyler just went ahead and did this a few months later, the results were much more important than just this one application, and throughout July and August of 2018, the community worked together to plot these full range of positions for the first time. And Pan and Koeck proposed a new name for the resulting shape, the Iwerlipse, named after Iver Songe and its ellipse-like shape. So how do we construct the Iwerlipse? Well, for one frame it's just a regular ellipse that you're probably sick of hearing about. For 2 frames we draw an ellipse of half height 3, and then at every point on the edge of this ellipse we draw a new ellipse with a half height of 1.5, and this gives all the positions we can reach after 2 frames. For 3 frames we draw an ellipse of half height 4.5, at every point on this ellipse draw a new ellipse of half height 3, and then at every point on all of these new ellipses we draw a third ellipse with half height 1.5. And as we go through all possible combinations of these 3 straining angles, we map out all the possible positions we can reach after 3 frames. Which bad boot was the first to compute? Now, it's horribly inefficient to produce the Iwerlipse by looking at all possible straining angles like this. The time it takes grows exponentially with the number of frames. But Arctan Straining saves the day. Since it gives us the max distance we can travel along each angle, Arctan Straining over all target angles will give us the full range of positions we can reach, producing the same shape with a fraction of the effort, and allowing us to get the Iwerlipse for any number of frames in linear time. So the Iwerlipse gives the total area reachable by Arctan Straining. It looks like an ellipse, but it isn't. An ellipse actually gives the range of positions you can reach with constant straining. Both have the same width and height, with the width growing linearly in time and the height growing quadratically thanks to the forward acceleration. But it's at the corners where we see the benefit of Arctan Straining. The extra distance we can get along any target angle increases as the total number of frames increases. This has absolutely nothing to do with anything, but this plot really reminded me of Planck's law of blackbody radiation at different temperatures, which, as well as its historical significance, also describes the spectrum of stars. Coincidence? Yes. Here is the Iwerlipse growing over time. Notice that it starts more elongated horizontally, since sideways straining is stronger for a single frame, and then becomes more and more elongated vertically as the forward velocity has time to accelerate. But we should also include the initial velocity and drag, which we've seen gives a constant displacement along the forward direction. Just like in a single frame, where we move a constant distance due to initial velocity and drag, and then by straining can end up anywhere within an ellipse. Over many frames, we move a constant distance and then by straining can end up anywhere within the Iwerlipse. And because this constant distance increases with time, the actual positions we can occupy grows in time like this. From our method of constructing the Iwerlipse, we can also derive formulas for the boundary of the Iwerlipse. By writing sine and cosine in terms of tan, and using the optimal straining relation, we find these expressions for the x and z coordinates on the boundary of the Iwerlipse as functions of the target angle omega. These were first found, as usual, by Iwer. They are exact expressions and easy to compute, so should probably be used all the time. But still, if we want a greater understanding, it may be beneficial to have closed form expressions that don't require a large summation. And we can obtain one by a simple approximation. In this example we have 8 frames, and the summation to calculate x requires summing 8 terms. Graphically, this is just equal to the total area of these green bars. We can instead imagine that there's a continuous line that runs through these points, and approximate the area of the discrete bars by the area under the continuous line, which in calculus we call integrating the curve. People had tried something similar, but they considered a continuous line from 0 to capital T. By shifting the range by half a frame, I was able to get a much better approximation. It's not very pretty, but it at least has no large summations and is very accurate. It should technically only be valid for a large number of frames, but it actually converges to the exact result incredibly quickly. Even for 2 frames it's really close, and as we increase through 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 frames, it quickly becomes indistinguishable from the exact result. Also, Grassdigger proposed that, since the Iwerlipse wasn't exactly an ellipse, perhaps it could be a super-ellipse, with general exponents n that are functions of time, or even a generalized super-ellipse with 2 different exponents. Indeed, Grassdigger showed that the Iwerlipse for 8 frames can be extremely well approximated by a generalized super-ellipse. By choosing the exponents m and n that minimize the error, I was able to obtain super-ellipse approximations for any number of frames. For 1 frame it's just a regular ellipse with both exponents equal to 2, and as time increases the exponents grow, as a result of the extra distance we can get by Arctan straining. Here are how the optimal exponents grow over time. Thus, we could also use this representation of the Iwerlipse, and for each t find the components m and n from a lookup table. But unlike my integral approximation, it never fully converges to the true result, there's always some small error. This shows that the Iwerlipse is not really a super-ellipse, but more like a sibling. The question I was wondering is, has this construction ever been studied before in the mathematical literature? I couldn't find any evidence, so please let me know if you know the answer. Maybe the Mario 64 ABC crew really did discover a new shape. The construction is simple, just iterate ellipses end to end, with the size of each iteration decreasing by a fixed amount in one direction, for example vertically. Perhaps then it could be called an iterated vertical ellipse, or an Iwerlipse for short, without Iwerlipse with a W being a special case. But let's carry on with our history. In October 2019, Silverstraw provided an alternative proof of the optimal straining relation, using a field of mathematics called the calculus of variations. It deals with problems where we have some sequence of variables, for example a path through space or quantity changing with time, and we want to minimize or maximize some quantity that's dependent on the whole sequence. I would argue it's the single most important tool in theoretical physics. It can solve simple toy problems, like finding the shape that minimizes the time for a bead to slide between 2 points. It can explain everyday occurrences like the shapes of soap films, and it can give profound insights. For example, minimizing the time for light to travel between 2 points can explain refraction. Since light travels slower through glass than it does through free space, the path bends to spend less time in the glass. It's even used in the standard model of particle physics. By minimizing a quantity called the action over all of space and time, it gives us all the particles and forces found in nature, with the notable exception of gravity. As Silverstraw realized, optimal straining is within the same class of problems, and by converting the discrete update equations into continuous differential equations, she was able to obtain the same result as Iwer. It was a great insight and will no doubt be used to optimize other types of movement in the future. I have some older notes where I go through Silverstraw's proof, which I'll leave in the description below. An important further step came from Critholith, best known as the creator of the brute forcing program Scattershot and discoverer of the modern carpetless setup. He independently rediscovered Iwer's original proof, and I believe he was the first to modify the optimal straining solution to account for quartersteps. Until now we've been assuming Mario moves a full frame's distance in one go, but his movement is actually broken down into 4 quartersteps per frame, which during air straining would look like this. If there's a collision during one of these quartersteps, Mario's movement can get cut short. So let's take our scenario of air straining over multiple frames and see what happens if we lose a quarterstep at the last frame. Notice that, as well as the final ellipse shrinking, the initial displacement on that frame has also shrunk, but these contributions have come from all the previous frames, so that when we do our trick of rearranging these arrows, the effective distance gained on each frame has received a quarter frame penalty, and the height of each effective ellipse shrinks. In this case we lost just 1 quarter frame, so the height of each is decreased by 1/4 of 1.5, and the optimal straining relation changes accordingly, with Q equal to the number of quarter frames lost. Notice that, unlike all the other frames, the ellipse for the last frame shrinks in both directions, not just vertically, so the total shape doesn't change, and the optimal straining for the last frame remains the same. With this modification, we can construct the Iwerlipse not just for whole frames, but also for the quarter frames in between. At this stage I may as well give these full formulas that work for all face angles, target angles, allow for quarter steps, and handle the trivial cases without letting the tan function blow up to infinity. Note that we have to add 180 degrees to the result if the target angle is behind us, since Arctan only gives results between plus and minus 90 degrees. Perhaps the most important contribution from a practical standpoint came in 2021, when SM64 Expert made Arctan Straining automatic and accessible to everyone by adding it to MK-Dash's input direction lure program. Let us do a practical demo to see how to use it. Imagine we're tassing the Klepto star in Shifting Sandland, and we want to find the perfect set of inputs that let us air strain from the first frame of our jump to the star in the shortest possible time. On our initial frame, frame 0, we can use Stroop to find the exact coordinates of Mario and the star, and we have to be within 117 units of the star to be inside its effective hitbox so that we can collect it. From our initial forward velocity and facing angle, we can use our Iwerlipse equations to find the range of positions we can reach over the next frames, and we find that the Iwerlipse first overlaps with the effective hitbox after 27 frames, and drawing the tangent line at this point, we find that reaching this point is equivalent to maximizing the distance along an angle of 341 degrees over 27 frames, justifying the equivalence between these two problems. So we've used our facing angle and forward velocity to find the target angle and total number of frames. How do we actually use this plugin to Arctan Strain? The first thing we need to do is convert our target angle of 341 degrees into the in-game units. Angles are stored as integers between 0 and 65,535, and 341 degrees is equivalent to 62,077 in-game units. So we just enter these parameters into the plugin and make sure the match angle and Arctan Strain buttons are enabled. So let's do it. I'm recording this in real time so it feels a bit more authentic and intimate. So I have a save state here, and we're just going to figure out the optimal inputs to get to this star in as few frames as possible. So we have our input direction plugin here. We're going to pause the game. We're going to load the state. The graphics won't change, but we are on this frame 0 of the TAS right now. So if you see here, you see our X coordinate and Z coordinate that I wrote down before, and also our H speed and our facing angle. And if we want, we can also get these from Stroop. You can see that they're the same. And also on Stroop we get the position of the star. So that's what we use to work out the target angle we need and the total number of frames. We're just going to set match angle, and we're going to set the angle of 62,077 that we worked out. We're going to click the Arctan Strain button. This number down here is going to be the frame where the Arctan Straining starts. So sometimes that might get desynced, but if you click Arctan Strain off and on again, that should be set to the current frame. We also need to set the total number of frames, so that's down here. What we've been calling capital T, but in input direction lure it's called capital N, and that can be changed with this button here. So we're going to increase that up to 27. Right, and then we should be good to go. We've got our state, and we're going to hold A for the first 10 frames just to make sure we have enough height. So let's go. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 frames. We're going to let go of A. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27. So if we now bring up Stroop again, oops, we see that I've enabled the hitboxes for the Star and Mario, so we see that they're overlapping, which is exactly what we predicted would happen. And we can also look at the effective hitbox of the Star, which was the 117 unit radius I was showing. And you can see that just as we predicted, we're inside the Star, which means that if we now go on to the next frame, we should collect the Star. And there we go. Perfect. Even though we have a mathematical proof, you may have a few objections. After all, the game has a few limitations that might make the proof invalid. For starters, there may be some floating point errors, but these are insignificant compared to the limited number of angles that the game can use. And even worse, the trigonometry table that the game uses only contains 4,096 entries, so groups of 16 angle values all have the same sine and cosine values and are thus effectively identical. From my research into BLJs, I have code that can run a simulation that takes into account all of these subtleties, and by running a simulated annealing algorithm, we can numerically maximize the distance and see if it matches our Arctan result. We will take an initial velocity of 15 and optimize the distance along an angle of 45 degrees over 30 frames. As an initial guess, we try straining constantly along 45 degrees, and we let the algorithm search for the global maximum. It looks like everything's going completely wrong, but sometimes things get worse before they get better, and everything will be okay in the end. Eventually, it does find the Arctan solution. Now let's try the same again, this time with a bit more initial speed, 30 instead of 15. I've always wanted to make an animation of one of these learning algorithms. This little guy at the end struggles a bit. Our algorithm has found a different solution than Arctan Straining. It looks like nonsense at first, but it beats our analytical formula easily. So what went wrong? We forgot about the drag boundaries and our assumption that drag is constant. If we look at the drag experience per frame, our Arctan formula doesn't know about the drag boundary, so it's constantly trying to cross it, whereas a numerical solution is smarter. It deliberately keeps the drag low. This is seen better if we look at the forward velocity over time. The Arctan result keeps trying to cross the soft cap of 48 and gets brought back down, whereas the numerical result keeps its forward velocity just under the cap. The algorithm has discovered something the TAS community calls the XX.99 trick. By keeping the forward velocity as close to 47.99 as possible, we maximize the forward velocity without going over the cap. And as a bonus, since we don't need to push full forward, this allows us to gain free sideways speed, and the numerical result ends up winning in terms of x distance and z distance. So this is just a friendly warning. If you're using Arctan Straining, make sure you don't cross any drag boundaries. But as we mentioned earlier, the drag boundaries are far enough apart that this condition isn't as restrictive as it sounds. Another consideration is that since Arctan Straining sacrifices forward velocity for extra sideways distance, we should only use it in situations where the final speed doesn't matter. For example, if at the end of the trajectory we grab a star, grab a ledge, or anything else that resets our speed. So this was the story of how the TAS and A Button Challenge team succeeded in finding the optimal inputs that allow us to perform mathematically perfect jumps by giving optimal straining relations and mapping out all the positions Mario can reach by air straining. Thanks for watching. This video took a lot of time and effort, so it would really help me out if you could like, subscribe and share this video to anyone who might be interested. And if you can afford it, please consider donating a small amount so I can carry on making videos. The donation link is in the description below, and if you donate I'll give you a shout out in my next video, which shouldn't take as long as this one to make. Special thanks to everyone I've mentioned in the video. All the videos I've referenced will be linked in the description. Thanks also to the Stroop, SM64 Decomp and Render96 development teams for all the assets I used. And I'll see you next time. Bye.